Chapter 35. Alex sat in the passenger seat of Matt's truck, wondering what he had planned next. They'd just finished dinner at the best little steakhouse in town, and he said he had more in mind, but he wouldn't tell her what. She fidgeted in her seat, wondering how long she'd have to wait to find out what he was up to. It wasn't long. Maybe a half-mile later, he pulled into another parking lot. He had to pull to the back to find an open space. She dug her ID and some cash out of her wallet and stuck them in the pocket of her jeans. They look busy tonight. I don't know if they're like this all the time or what. Not usually, though sometimes depending on who's playing. Playing? He killed the engine and looked at her for a second. You mean they've got a live band? Sometimes. Great, I've not heard any of the local bands yet. He got out, then went around and opened her door, but didn't offer to help her out. Once she was out, he closed and locked the truck, then wrapped one arm around her waist. Pulling her close, he dropped a quick kiss against her mouth, then pulled back. Let's go inside. His arm was still around her waist. They went around the building to the door, which he insisted on holding open for her. Oh, I know this band, she said as she passed him. They're good. She noticed he looked a little lost as he followed her inside, but it was all right, she knew her way around. She pushed her way to the bar, talking to a couple people here and there, just enough to keep moving but not seem rude. At the bar, she asked for a shot of Patron, then turned back to Matt. What do you want? He glanced around, taking stock of what was on the shelf. I'll have a bottle of Miller. Alex turned around and repeated his order, reaching for her wallet, but a credit card appeared in front of her face before she could get her money out of her pocket. She turned and looked at Matt, frowning. My date, I pay. He handed her the card. Start a tab. She rolled her eyes but took it. When the bartender returned with their drinks, she gave him the card. He set it next to the register and started a list of their drinks. She handed Matt his bottle and picked up her shot, taking the salt and lime with her. They moved around the room until they found an empty table to sit down. She scooted her chair around to sit as close to him as she could manage, then leaned close. They're pretty good, aren't they? She half shouted so he could hear her over the music. He glanced at her, then looked back to the band, nodding. She tried to look at them as if she'd never heard or seen them before, to maybe get an idea of what he was seeing. The band consisted of 4 men. Most of them older, or at least older to her. They were probably closer to 50 than 30, except for one. The one who stood in the middle and did most of the singing was different. He stood out for several reasons, and being the youngest in the group wasn't the most obvious. Most of them joined in and sang back up, occasionally taking a line here or there on their own, but they didn't have nearly the voice of the young guy. She kept listening as she licked the side of her hand and sprinkled a good amount of salt on it. She looked back up at the band, then licked the salt off her hand, chugged down her shot and bit down on the lime slice they'd given her. Feeling eyes on her, she turned to Matt to find him watching her, his eyes full of heat. He bent till his mouth was against her ear. Next shot, you lick the salt off me, not your hand. Pulling the rind from her mouth, she grinned. I can do that. She settled back against him to listen to the band and watch people. The next song started, and recognizing the first notes, she jumped to her feet. Come on, this is a good one. Come dance with me. She pulled him to his feet and dragged him out on the floor. I've got to warn you, I'm not much of a dancer. I'll try for you, but I'm not very good, he said as he followed her onto the dance floor, his beer in one hand. I don't care if you're good, just dance with me. She moved up close and enjoyed the feeling of his arms around her while they moved to the music. She had deliberately chosen a slow song so they could be close, and dancing wouldn't take a whole lot of skill. Pretty dancing wasn't what mattered to her. Having fun, and being willing to do it with her did. She didn't know how much fun he was having, but he'd passed the willing part. They finished the dance and went back to their table. When the waitress came by, he ordered another patron for her, telling him which card was his at the bar. They stayed another hour or so. She had 2 more shots, licking her salt off his collarbone instead of her hand. Then taking the lime from between his teeth. He nursed the 1 beer, then switched to water. She was a little buzzed, but not as bad as most people would be after 3 shots in an hour. Shifter bodies metabolized alcohol differently, and it took a lot to get them truly drunk. After paying their tab, he walked her out to the truck and helped her in before going around and getting in himself. "We headed back to the house?" she asked, buckling her seatbelt. "Not yet." He glanced at her and smiled as he started the truck. She stuck out her lower lip. "Here I was hoping you'd gotten me drunk so you could take me home and have your way with me." Matt chuckled. "You're not drunk and I wouldn't have to get you drunk for that. I've got one more thing planned." He took Main Street to the 180, then south. She wondered where he was headed. This was only taking them farther from home. Yeah, he'd said that wasn't where they were going, but still. They passed the city limits and into Eager, and he kept going. When they hit the light at Highway 260, he turned onto the highway and headed out of town, confusing her. There wasn't much out here, and he seemed to be passing what little there was. When they passed the sign advertising the 26 Bar Ranch, she couldn't keep her mouth shut anymore. "Did you know that place used to belong to John Wayne?" she asked. "Which one?" "That one." She pointed. "The 26 Bar. It's a bed and breakfast now, but he used to own it once upon a time. They still tell stories about him riding his horse into town to go to the bar." They reached the turnoff for Highway 261, and Matt slowed and turned onto it. "Why are we going up the mountain?" "Why are you so full of questions?" he countered. "Can't you just sit back and enjoy? Or talk without grilling me about where we're going and why?" He picked up her hand and kissed the back to soften his words. She sighed. "I guess I could, but I was hoping you'd take me home and I could get you back into bed." She couldn't help but grin. "That's part of why I'm taking you out. So we can get to know each other better out of bed. And I don't just mean the sex, though that was good too." He kissed her hand again, then put it on the console, as he put both hands on the wheel. This was an old-fashioned mountain road, and while she knew he'd been driving them for years, she also knew he hadn't been driving this one. Plus, after having lost his wife to an accident on a road like this one, she didn't blame him for wanting to be more careful. They talked and asked each other questions as he drove, until they passed a cattle guard and he slowed the truck. "Is something wrong?" she asked, concerned. "No, I just don't want to miss it." "Miss what?" "This." He turned off the road into a small parking area, and all at once she knew why they'd come up here. She'd heard about teenagers coming up here in high school, but she'd never liked anyone enough to let them bring her. Now she was glad someone had told him about it. "Come on, let's go look." He killed the engine and twisted around to grab something from the seat behind them. After a moment, she realized it was one of the quilts from the rack in her living room. He got out, and she waited for him to come around. Her lightweight blouse wouldn't be enough in the cool wind this place was known for, and that was during the day. At night it would be downright cold. When he opened the door, she slid down into his arms. He'd already unfolded the quilt enough that he had it wrapped around his shoulders like a cape, and enfolded her in it. "It's cold up here." "Yeah." She shivered against him for a moment. "Come on, we're here, we might as well go look." She led him down the walkway and stairs that led to the overlook. It was a cement balcony-like area, with plaques of information on Round Valley, as it could be seen below. It was too dark to read the plaques, even with their enhanced night vision, but they stood and looked at the lights with Alex pointing out the ones she knew, like the dome. Looks like something's going on in the dome tonight. No idea what though. It's not sports season. I've seen that. What exactly is it? The football field, but it's more than that. It's also used for volleyball and basketball and non-school events too. They hold a car show in there and a model airplane show. It's used for a lot of things. It looks like a professional sports arena. It's similar but smaller. I've heard it's the only high school football dome in the country. That's unique for such a small town. Isn't it? She turned and looked up at him a moment, then looked back out at the valley below them. Where's your place? He asked, his arms warm around her. Out there. She pointed to a dark area to the right of the dome. There were scattered lights to the left of it, but to the right, at least as far out as her place, it was dark. I don't see it. He tightened his arms around her for a moment. No, you can't from here. The trees hide the lights. We're not the only place you can't see because of the trees. The Khan's place borders ours to the west, but you don't see any of his lights either. It's part of why we keep the trees around. We'd be able to graze more cattle if it were pastures. I didn't realize his place bordered yours. Yeah, that's part of why they sent people to help with the bear. She rubbed her side under the blanket. Her wound was healed, but it still itched a little. She knew it was from the skin healing and did her best to ignore it. It was as much of a danger to their cattle as ours. Not that he wouldn't have helped otherwise, but it helped make it more urgent. And why he's been sending hands to help out your dad. No, he'd have done that anyway. He did it while we were in Denver too. He tries to make sure his clan is taken care of and has what they need. It's part of why we love him and Rebecca so much. They're good to us. They fell quiet for a while, just enjoying being together, alone with the view. The wind kicked up, sending a blast of cold air swirling up under the blanket and making Alex shiver. Come on, let's get out of this wind. Matt walked her back to the truck, helped her in, then went around to his door and got in. He tossed the blanket across her lap instead of in the back seat. You ready to head home? I can move the truck so we can keep looking at the lights if you'd prefer. He looked at her, waiting for a response. Home. She leaned over the console and kissed his cheek. She'd briefly considered dragging him into the back seat for some fun, but the last thing she wanted was to get caught and have it get back to her folks that she'd been fooling around in a car up here. Settling back into her seat, she fastened her seatbelt and pretended to be patient while he drove.